Well, hey everybody, it's Mr. Schauber, and welcome to our presentation on the 1920s. I'm going to start out by asking you a question. What was the best year of your life to this point, and what made it the best? I want you to think about that. And, you know, if you were to ask people who lived through the 1920s what was the best year of their life, a lot of them probably would have said some point in the 1920s. And why is that? Well, America had just got done with World War One, and we came out of World War One the best of any of the countries involved in the First World War. Uh, yes, we had suffered quite a bit of loss ourselves, but not like England and France and Germany and Austria-Hungary and so forth. We hadn't suffered as badly as they had, and of course we know how bad Germany and Austria-Hungary suffered as a result of the peace treaty after the war. But the United States enters into a period of prosperity, of a booming economy, and of transformation of the nation in the 1920s. And so this is kind of a golden era for a lot of people in the United States. It's a time when modern conveniences, uh, at least more modern conveniences and new technology will be introduced, and life changes for for most Americans for the better in the 1920s. And so I kind of look at the 1920s as kind of the first modern American decade, kind of one of the decades that really defines modern history in the United States. So let's look now at the 20s and what made it so interesting. One of the nicknames of the 1920s is the Roaring Twenties because things were roaring, they were booming. It's an era of prosperity. More money is flowing. The economy is great for most of the decade. You know, people have more money to spend. It's also a time of Republican power. We had three Republican presidents during the 1920s, and most of Congress was Republican during the 1920s, and so that kind of defines the decade. But it's also a time of conflict. We had uh, the women's rights issue come in, and so some men thought women shouldn't have the rights that they wanted, and so you had that conflict. You also had the conflict of alcohol, people that wanted to drink versus people who thought that we should prohibit alcohol. And we'll talk about that. Um, and you had things like the KKK. And so you had the racial issues, the social issues, all kinds of issues in the 1920s that will clash. And so the 20s is a very interesting decade, no doubt about it. Let's look first at the age of prosperity. This is a time of economic expansion. Like I said, big business is booming. More companies are making new products, and the technology is advancing rapidly. And so you have people, the average person had more money to spend probably than they'd ever had before. But you also have the ultra rich that continued on as well. And of course, we'd had the ultra rich in the US, a handful of them forever, but especially starting really in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and then that continues on into the 1920s. You also have mass production of goods, and we'll talk about Henry Ford and in his Ford automobile company. But because of Ford's idea of mass production and the assembly line that he kind of perfected, other companies go to that model and mass produce products. Like I said, on the assembly line, when you mass produce a product, it drives the cost for the consumer down because the market is flooded with that product, and so consumers can buy it for less money. And if they can spend less to buy a product they want, obviously that demand for that product goes up. And so this is a win-win for big business and for the consumer. And here are pictures of the assembly line. Uh, you can see which, they could, for the cars anyway, they could pump out Model Ts and other cars just so quickly compared to having to build them, individually by hand. It revolutionizes the factory world, the consumer world. It revolutionizes everything economically. And the 20s is the age of the automobile, no doubt about it. This is when cars really become a household item. This is when the average family now can afford a car, and we'll get into that, why that was. But this changes everything. And you think of the impact the car had on America, all the new industries and businesses that have to now exist because of the car. I mean, literally, was, the car was the computer and the internet, so to speak, of its age. How it just transformed business and the economy and just everything. The 20s is like I said, called the Roaring 20s. It's also called the Jazz Age because of the new style of music, jazz, that swept the nation, and people just couldn't get enough. Modern America is born at this time. And it's a time of liberation. When some people reject traditional social restraints, they live a freer life. Again, you have the clashes that will exist, but between the traditional and the quote unquote modern. You have the social, the religious, the racial. You have all these different conflicts or clashes, uh, and some people see their new way of living as liberating, while other people see that new way as a step backward. And so the 20s is going to be really interesting because of that. The presidents of the 1920s. I told you there were three Republican presidents. We had Warren G. Harding to start the decade. He will pass away, and his successor is Calvin Coolidge. And then Calvin Coolidge, when he is done, Herbert Hoover will be elected in 1928. And so you know what these Republicans ran on really was, after we had a Democrat in Woodrow Wilson, and that led us through World War One. The Republicans really played on the idea that we're going to bring business back, booming again, which happened. We're going to stay out of other people's entanglements. We're going to be more isolationist, which we were, and so and times are good, and when economic times are good, and when the country is going through a prosperous period, by and large, people give credit to the president, and things run fairly smoothly, and they keep electing the same guys or from the same party because things are good, right? So why change things up? So this was kind of the story of politics in the 1920s. Interesting story about Calvin Coolidge. I really like. Um, Coolidge had a reputation as a really skilled public speaker, but in private, he was a man of very few words. In fact, he got the nickname Silent Cal. Okay, and just kind of a funny story, if you will, about these three. I mean, Harding was more serious, Coolidge was more quiet, Herbert Hoover was really smart. Um, but I love the story about Calvin Coolidge because Silent Cal, right? And so his wife, Grace Coolidge, once told the story of a young woman who sat next to President Coolidge at a dinner party. And the woman told Coolidge that she had bet that she could get him to say at least three words because Calvin Coolidge was known to be a man of very few words. So she said, "Hey, I made a bet I could get you to say at least three words, and just say three words or more, and I win the bet, right, with my friend." And without even looking at her, the president said in his typically dry wit, "You lose," and that was all. Okay, that's all he said. And so that was the kind of thing that you know Coolidge was known as kind of being a quiet guy, but very kind of just he kept the ball rolling. He kept things really kind of humming along in the 1920s. So that was politics in the 20s. Something else that defines the 20s, and as you're seeing here, there's so many aspects to the decade, but what's called the Red Scare. In March of 1917, Tsar Nicholas II over in Russia had lost his popularity as a result of poor decisions. We'd already talked about Russia's involvement and the disaster uh, that was World War I for the Russian army and the Russian people. Um, There were food shortages. Of course, we talked about how the royal family had let that Rasputin in as kind of an advisor, which was also a disaster. And so Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate his power and step down. Well, this man, Vladimir Lenin, on the left, saw his opportunity. And Lenin and his followers, referred to as the Bolsheviks, took power on November 6, 1917. And the Bolsheviks brought in communism. Uh, and what ends up happening is, because the communist system is so openly hostile and opposed to the American beliefs of capitalism and private ownership of land and business and your freedom of speech and religion and so forth. Communism is so opposed to those things that a kind of a paranoia set in here in the United States as early as 1919. This Red Scare, this fear of communism, happens here in the U.S., where Americans are just very leery about, our foreigners that are coming in bringing these communist ideas, or do fellow Americans have these communist ideas? And the idea is that you can't let these communist ideologies take hold here because we are a capitalist, democratic, free nation, and communism seeks to tear that down. And so the Red Scare was a real thing. You started wondering, are any of my neighbors communists, and are there spies here, spying on us and our system, and it's kind of this paranoia sets in. So that was what the Red Scare was all about. And as a result of the Red Scare, uh, nativism kind of takes hold, and Americans start to become very skeptical of immigrants. They start to associate immigration with radicalism because these immigrants might bring in radical ideas like communism or other things. And so the government passes an Immigration Act of 1921. It establishes a quota system to only allow a certain number of immigrants each year to come in. In 1924, the United States banned immigration altogether from East Asia, like China. So this nativism really, and of course the Red Scare contributed to it. But the nativism is the idea that native-born Americans are better than immigrants. The native-born Americans are more likely to uphold American ideals than immigrants are, and so forth. And whether that's true or not, is, I guess, an opinion. But this is the idea that takes hold, because when you're afraid of something, like some Americans got to be afraid of communism, then you do things to compensate for that fear. And that's true with anything in life. And so this idea of nativism uh, really grips the country for a lot of people. And so why we call it the Red Scare, by the way, about communism and so forth, is because the Reds were the nickname given to the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, who took over the country of Russia and made it communist. So communism became associated with red. Okay, the word red, and of course the Russian flag becomes this red flag, right? And so red became symbolic of communism. Well, as mentioned, the Ku Klux Klan also reemerges in the 1920s. Uh, the Klan feared anybody who posed a challenge to traditional values, okay, what they deemed as traditional. Of course, the Klan had started after the Civil War in Tennessee and then spread throughout the South. But by the very late 18 to very early 1900s, it had pretty much not necessarily disappeared, but it had really been reduced. But in the 1920s, it kind of has a resurgence. Okay, and part of that resurgence is due to the Red Scare, and part of it's due to nativism, and but the Klan, you will see, is opposed to anybody who's not like them. So who were members of the Klan by and large? Well, they were Southern whites who were Protestants, and so as you will see, they're opposed to anybody who is not that. Okay, including so they're they're anti-black. Okay? They're anti-Catholic because they were Protestants, so they're anti-Catholic. Anti-immigrant. This is your nativism idea. Anti-Semitic, which basically meant anti-Jewish. Okay? They are anti-women's suffrage or women's voting rights because that was not traditional. Okay, they said. And they're anti-bootleggers. They are anti-people who would illegally make and sell alcohol because they say, well, we're these pure Protestants, and alcohol is the cause of so much evil and crime and so forth. So we're anti that. So they're anti all kinds of things, right? And it was really crazy. The South becomes a real interesting place in a lot of areas because of the Klan in the 1920s. Also in the 1920s, you have a thing called the Great Migration. Now, this was kind of a second Great Migration because the first one had happened after the Civil War, where a lot of African Americans in the South said, "Hey, I'm out of here. I'm leaving. Uh, I'm looking for a new start up in the North." And uh, this then will kind of happen again in the 1920s. Throughout the early 1900s, jobs for African Americans in the South had been scarce, right, and very low paying. And so many factory jobs were simply closed to Black Americans. And so, but as the industries expanded in the 20s and as factories started to produce more things and there were more factories just overall, many new job opportunities opened up for African Americans in the North. See, the South still stayed more agricultural, and the South was slower to industrialize than the North was, and that goes back to Civil War times. And by the 1920s, it was still that way. And so the North had most of the factories and most of the, they were producing most of the goods. Well, so new job opportunities open up for blacks in the North because of this. So uh, the North didn't turn out to be a promised land necessarily for African Americans. They still faced a lot of, racism, or there was a lot of racial tension still, because a lot of whites thought that these blacks were coming up to take their jobs and their livelihood. So it didn't turn out to be quite the you know the uh, the haven that a lot of blacks wanted it to be, but it was still better than the South in most cases. Um, so a lot of blacks did though take jobs in the North, and tons of them moved from the South to the North in the early 1900s through the 1920s. And so that's what populates the cities like Detroit and New York City. Your African American populations start growing in those places, places like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Milwaukee, and so this is where your black populations really that we see today in these big cities in the North. That's kind of really when it starts, is in the early 1900s to 1920s. And here's a picture, a map showing you the migration route of a lot of African Americans and settling in these big cities, right? Because the big cities is where the factories were and that's where the jobs were. So places like Minneapolis and St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, Pittsburgh. Like I said, places like this, Cincinnati, Boston. These are where a lot of the African Americans go looking for jobs. So the question is change a good thing? Why or why not? Well, obviously you're probably thinking, well, it depends on what the change is. I think you're exactly right. But is change a good thing? Why or why not? And why can change be so difficult at times? Because sometimes change is really good, depending on the circumstance and the issue. And sometimes change is really difficult. So, why can it be so difficult? Well, we're going to see a difficult, quote unquote, change taking place with the Scopes monkey trial. I told you earlier that the 20s is a time of clashes, conflicts between tradition and modernity, or quote unquote progress in some people's minds. And so one of those issues that is front and center with this conflict of tradition versus more modern is this trial, the Scopes trial. What was this all about? Well, it's a clash between evolution and creationism. The ideas of people like Charles Darwin versus the ideas of the Bible, the ideas of science versus religion. Okay. And this becomes a worldwide case. It's not just in the United States here, but it grips the world because people all over the world want to see, okay, what's going to be decided and how is this going to impact maybe my area of the world, my country, my city. And so let's figure out what this case was all about. All right, it starts with this guy, John Scopes, who's a high school biology teacher in the little town of Dayton, Tennessee. John Scopes, as a biology teacher there, started teaching evolution, that man was evolved from apes, and that that things evolve right over time. Well, that was actually illegal to teach back then in your high school biology classes, and the reason was because, especially in the South, where Tennessee is, you were supposed to teach creationism, that God created the world and God created man and woman. And okay, and so when he starts teaching evolution, that God didn't create the world and man and woman, but that we evolved, okay, from apes, and the Big Bang theory, accounts for the creation of the world, then he is breaking the law. Well, because of this, he is sued and he goes on trial. And you have a couple of famous lawyers come into town, into this little tiny town of Dayton, Tennessee, and Clarence Darrow and Williams Jennings, William Jennings Bryan. I'll get it right. And these guys are already famous. Clarence Darrow, famous uh, defense lawyer, and William Jennings Bryan, who had run numerous times for president. He was there to prosecute. And I mean, this is just a circus, literally. Okay, people would come from all over the place, all over the country, to this little town of Dayton, Tennessee, to see what happens in this case. And people packed the courtroom, and people outside the courtroom, and people would bring monkeys all dressed up, and you had street preachers on the corner talking about reading your Bible, and and so you had, I mean, both sides were represented here, and it was in you had in all the papers from around the world. You had newspaper people from Europe and from South America, all over the place, right? And so this becomes the issue. Then, is it okay to teach evolution in school? And what direction are we going to go with our science classes and in school and our science beliefs in general? Well, after it's all said and done, and of course, these lawyers put on a great show. Okay, Scopes is found guilty of teaching evolution, which he did not deny that he was teaching it. He's found guilty and fined, and later the ruling is overturned on a technicality. But the result, long term, from this is that eventually, of course, evolution starts to be taught more in school science classes than creationism, and that's how it is today. And so you see the religion and the religious aspect being, weeded out, taken out of schools, and that really kind of starts with this Scopes monkey trial. So, kind of in summary, then, the 20s is an age of prosperity. It's an overall good economy. People have more money to spend. They're going to buy more products, and life is going to be made in some ways easier. It's the birth of modern America, a time for a lot of people to break traditional way of living, and we'll talk more about that. You had the three Republican presidents during the decade. You have the Red Scare, the Communist Scare, a lot of anti-immigrant nativism, okay, sentiment during the decade. And one example of that is the famous case here on the picture down below of two Italian immigrants called names Sacco and Vanzetti are their last names. Nicola Sacco was a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti was he sold fish, a fish peddler. Okay, what had happened was uh, on April 15th, 1920, gunmen robbed and killed the guard and paymaster of a shoe factory in a town in Massachusetts. Well, a few weeks later, police arrested these two men, these two Italian immigrants, in connection with the crime. Both men were carrying guns when they got arrested. I mean, weeks after the actual uh, crime was committed, and um, and Sacco's gun was the same model used in the crime. Yet a lot of people, a lot of Americans who heard about this, suspected that the real reason the two men were accused of the crime was that they were immigrants, not that they had actually done the crime. And so the case grew huge national and international attention and controversy. And you got to remember, this nativist sentiment existed among a lot of people, and they looked very skeptically at immigrants. And so Sacco and Vanzetti were put on trial. They were convicted, and they were sentenced to death. And in 1927, 7 years after the crime was committed, and again remains in question, were they even the ones that did it? They're executed. And so this was a very controversial, you know, uh, controversial thing and a controversial trial. And so, but again, this is part of the 20s, right? And the Scopes monkey trial, of course, was the creationism versus evolution, which we just got done talking about. So the 20s is action packed. It's full of everything. It has all aspects that would go into a great novel or a great movie, right? And so now let's look at the assignment that you have, the daily life in the 1920s and pop culture, which is going to go over some of these things we just talked about, but also we're going to go into more detail and then some new things that we haven't talked about. All right, let's talk about this. The consumer economy. This is going to be one of the defining characteristics of the 1920s. Um, the average annual income in 1920 was $1,574, but a gallon of milk cost only 58 cents. And things like bread and fruit and other things were much cheaper than they are today. So the average person, the average salary in 1920 was basically $1,500 a year, but that went a long way. Okay, the population of the U.S. was about 122 million in 1920, with about 50% of the people living in the cities and about 50% of the people living in farming or rural areas. Thus, 50% of the population still farm for a living. Today, it's about 2% that farm for a living. And so times have changed, obviously, right? But this consumer economy is going to happen because people are making 1,500 bucks a year, and then as the 20s goes on, they're going to start making more money than that because the economy's good and jobs are good and they get pay raises and inflation, of course, occurs, and so they're going to make more money and they're going to spend their money. That's what a consumer economy is that it's an economy that's good for the buyer, the consumer, to buy new things. And so, what kinds of things did people buy with their newfound money in the 1920s? Well, let's look. They bought things like washing machines. Yes, that is an old washing machine. You'd have to actually put the clothes. You'd wash them in this basin, this tub, and then you'd put them through those yellow rollers, and that used that crank on the side and crank them through, and you would actually roll the clothes right through. And but that was and washing was an all day type venture, right, for people, because you didn't have the washing machines today where you just throw the clothes in and let them do their job and then take them out and put them in the dryer. You actually had to wring the clothes out and so forth, and then you'd hang them up, usually on a clothesline, and let Mother Nature dry them. But this was a new and improved way of washing clothes rather than going to a stream or just another type of basin or using a washboard. Okay, uh, what is that there that I just brought up? That's your stove and oven. Yes, it's much smaller ovens than we have today, but An oven. Think about this. Think about how that was a change in how people cooked. Okay, and you could use gas or electricity for your stove and to heat things up. So you didn't have to build a fire uh, and have a fire heat up a big pot or I don't know, a tub and boil water that way. You could do it on a stove and you could put food in an oven to cook it instead of doing it over an open fire. This changes so much. Okay, things like electric tools are able to come around now because of electricity being widespread. The earliest refrigerators, yep, that is a refrigerator with the cooling unit up there on top. But early refrigerators, again, much smaller than today. But think about this: a refrigerator, instead of having to put food, in a cellar or try to pack it with ice or things like that. I mean, this changes everything. Okay, telephones, of course, right? Waffle makers. That looks like an interesting tool. That is actually an early type of dentist apparatus tool type thing. And irons. So these are some of the things people would buy in the 20s, and this new technology and a great economy made things nice for the consumer, right? And some people started buying on the installment plan as well. The installment plan is where, of course, we could call it today buying on credit. Maybe I don't have all the money I need up front to buy the item, but I can put money down and then I can make payments over time to pay off the rest, right? Of course, those payments are made with interest, so I end up paying, if I just make payments, I end up paying much more for the item in the end than I would have paid for it if I had just paid cash all up front. But that's how people can afford to get into maybe cars and things they couldn't afford to get into otherwise. So people would buy things on credit, and those included everything from cars to vacuum cleaners to washing machines and sewing machines and radios and things like that. But this becomes an interesting, uh, and it opens up new possibilities. Let's put it that way for the consumer. Also in 1920, this is interesting. You can see the population and the distribution of the population. Uh, you can see the smaller dots are 10,000 up to 250,000 people, which would have included Salt Lake and Provo and Ogden, which are there represented in Utah. But the bigger dots are a quarter of a million up to a million, and then the biggest dots are over a million. So you see where the population centers were. Of course, the cities with over a million people back then um, were, places like Boston and New York, okay, and um, Chicago, okay. So, but yeah, this is where all the population was. Of course, out west it was pretty sparse, right? And out east it was much more concentrated. And then again, this is kind of another representation, just showing you even more. One dot represents 10,000 people. Okay, so you can see where, I mean, that where, of course, where most of the people are is going to be where most of the factories are, and where most of the jobs are, and where the economy is the best. Where there are fewer people, that's more of your farmland areas, right? And this is where the food growing is going to take place. Of course, in the farming areas, the electricity is going to be slower to reach them. Maybe all the new technology and all the new gadgets, they're a little slower to reach some of the rural areas, but eventually they did. But I mean, anyway, you can kind of see how things were dispersed. All right, let's go now to your questions on your paper again. What was the role of the car before the 1920s? Well, before the 20s, uh, the cars were a plaything for wealthy people. They were too expensive for most people to own. There were very few cars on roads. In fact, there were really hardly any roads, right? It was just dirt. But they were seen by many people as outrageous, as dangerous. There was a lack of laws because hardly anybody had cars, so you didn't have car laws. Uh, and then they started coming up with crazy laws, like the first laws. You had a guy had to walk in front of the car with a red flag as a warning to people that an automobile was coming down the street. Well, eventually, and it doesn't take long, for all that to change. So what happens in the 1920s to make owning a car a necessity? Well, what happens is mass production. What happens is Henry Ford and his assembly line. Henry Ford sets up shop in the Detroit area in Michigan, and he starts his cars, first the Model T, there on the left, uh, and he starts mass producing it on the assembly line. When he mass produces it, the price of it drops. It becomes available to the common person. It becomes available to the masses. And so he also improved reliability. It was safer. There were fewer breakdowns. Comfort went up. Okay. Eventually, it was assumed that you had a car, and you probably had a Model T Ford. Okay. So, a car in the late 19 teens, early to late 19 teens, cost about $1,500 a year, which is what the average person made in a year. So it was a whole year's salary worth. That would be the cost of a car. So that's why hardly anybody had one. But by 1924, by the mid 20s, the Model T cost $290, basically a fifth or so of the average person's salary. And so every family pretty much could now afford a car. And this became the thing. This was the craze, right? And so Henry Ford made automobile ownership possible for the mass population. So, how did the automobile, next question, change American lifestyles in the 20s? Well, it before we look at this picture, it revolutionized the concept of distance and time. The car changes all of that. Before, if you went 20 miles in a day, uh, walking, that was a long way to go in a day, 20 miles in a whole day. Well, now you can go 20 miles an hour, right? Uh, in the Model T Ford, you could cover the same distance in an hour that you could cover before in a day, right? It makes the distance you could go and the time it took you to get there, it changes all that. Okay, because of that, leisure time is up, free time is up, travel opportunities are up. Now you can go visit family, friends in other cities, other states, potentially, right? Um, it changes even in courtship rituals. Um, Before the 1920s, if a guy was interested in a girl, he would go to her house and quote unquote call on her, basically knock on the door, and the dad would answer and, yes, can I call on your daughter? And that basically meant, I'm very interested in your daughter. I really want to start dating her seriously and maybe get married. Okay, I mean, imagine that, right? And of course, before the 20s, if the dad was okay with it and the girl was okay with it, then you, as a couple, you would go on walks around the neighborhood or around the town, but you'd always be accompanied by one of the girl's male relatives, the dad, a brother, somebody like that. Well, the 20s changes all that. Okay, now couples can be alone without a chaperone, and they can go for a drive in the car and things like that. So it changes, everything from distance and time down to courtship rituals. It also changes Sunday church attendance. Sunday church attendance goes down in the 20s because the Sunday drive to the countryside, is now a thing, and so less people are going to church, which they had traditionally done. It also creates an industrial boom. Think of all the things now that are going to be needed because the cars are so prevalent. Uh, the steel industry, okay? So people like Andrew Carnegie and JP Morgan are going to cash in big, right? The rubber industry for your tires, right? Your gasoline industry. So people like John D. Rockefeller are going to cash in big, right? You're going to have things like hotels, motels, road building, eventually highway building. You're going to have these drive-in restaurants, fast food restaurants becomes a thing now because people can drive to a restaurant and get some food and leave. And so I mean, and the very first fast food restaurant ever was the A&W. Imagine that, hot dogs 15 cents, root beer floats 20 cents. Man, if root beer floats still cost 20 cents, I'd have about 5 a day. Um, that would be bad for me. But think of all how everything changes because of the car. That one product Now, think of all the jobs, all the industries that are now in demand. You need to have auto body shops, mechanic shops, right? Uh, to change oil in cars, to fix cars. I mean, everything, all these, all the economy is just completely revolutionized basically by the car alone, let alone all the other products in the 20s. Go to the mall, so to speak, a strip mall type thing, and hotels and parking lots, right? Parking lots become a thing. One interesting thing about the Model T is that what most people are driving is that the Model T came in one color and they were all alike. And that's how Henry Ford kept the cost down, was he could mass produce them on the assembly line, but they were all painted black. They all look the same, right? You make them all the same, and that's you keep the price lower. And so I always kind of joke, imagine these in these parking lots, imagine trying to find your car. If everybody else is pretty much driving a Model T also, how do you find yours from theirs, right? That'd be interesting. All right, let's look at now the next section, the revolution in the American home. How did electricity change the American home in the 20s? Well, as kind of mentioned previously, your ice box becomes your refrigerator. People are using refrigerators now to keep food cold, and to preserve it longer. They don't have to eat it up right away when they get it, or they don't have to try to pack it in ice or keep it outside, to keep it cooler or whatever. They put it in the fridge. I mean, imagine all the things that you eat that you take out of your refrigerator that are a few days old, a week or two old, depending on what it is, and you can still eat it just fine. It's still good, but that you wouldn't be able to do that if you didn't have a fridge. The food would have gone bad by then. So a refrigerator, um, you know, is a new product. The coal stove becomes the electric stove and oven. Instead of having to go get coal and shovel coal into a stove and keep a fire going, and now you can have electricity uh, for a stove and an oven to make food or to heat it up, things like that. And then for lighting, the kerosene lamps or the candles, okay, become the electric lights. And you know what this does in the end, not only does it make people's lives a little easier and comfort goes up, things like that, but time, particularly for women who did most of the housework back then, uh, the time, the free time, the leisure time starts going up for women because it doesn't take as long to do things anymore. And so this leads to kind of a woman's revolution, uh, during this decade. So so many things change. That's why I call the 20s kind of America's first modern decade because I mean this is look at all the changes. All right. Next question: how did indoor plumbing change American lifestyles in the 20s? Well, I mean massively, right? Increased convenience, increased sanitation, and it led to bathing more than once a week, right? So let's look at that real fast. Obviously, this comes to the cities before it comes to the farming areas, right? But the old outhouse, you don't need to get up in the middle of the night and go to an outhouse anymore. Outside, especially think of that about that. It's winter time, middle of winter. You got to go to the bathroom. It's 3 in the morning. You either hold it, or you go in your pants, or you get up and go to the outhouse, right, in the freezing cold. Well, now you don't have to do that. Now you can go inside to your bathroom and go to the bathroom. And then you can wash your hands with soap and water coming out of a faucet. Okay. And so, you know, your sanitation goes up. It's obviously more convenient. And bathing more than once a week, well, traditionally, you went to church on Sundays, so you would take a bath on a Saturday. But you would usually have to fill up a big tub, a big basin full of water, which you had to go to a well and get bucket by bucket to fill it up. And then you try to heat it up. Okay. And then because it was such a pain to do that, you couldn't drain the water after every person's bath and refill it. You just didn't have the resources or the time to do that. So the whole family would take turns taking a bath in the same water. You start with dad, and then he'd get done, and mom would get in, and then she'd get done, and then the oldest kid would get in, all the way down to the littlest. Well, you can imagine what the bath water was like by the time the little kids got in, right? Now you can bathe more than once a week because bathing is easier, and you can drain water, after each person's bath and refill the tub or whatever. And it's just talk about just better, right? So more sanitation, so disease is less, and the convenience goes just way up. People, it's just better all around for everybody, for society, right? So little things like that, which are not really little, they're huge, but we don't probably stop and think about stuff like that every day. And for most of human history, people have not had electricity in their homes, and they have not had indoor plumbing. So you think about how most people have lived for human history, very different from how we lived, at least in those aspects. All right. The next question. Talk about fashions, fads, and feats of the 1920s. What changes came to women's fashions? Well, women went through a revolution in the 20s. At least some did. Uh, some women became known as the flappers, right? The flapper girls, which is still a popular Halloween costume for a lot of females. But what was the flapper? Well, the flapper was this new type of girl, and it kind of going against traditional ways that a woman was supposed to look or act or things like that. And and so usually these were younger women, late teens, early 20s to mid 20s type women, but they cut their hair shorter. Short hair was a trademark of the flappers because traditionally women wore long hair. Okay, they had shorter skirts down to the knees. That was considered short. Okay, because traditionally the hemline or the bottom of the skirt went down to the ankles. Started wearing sleeveless things, which you never did before. Okay, um, they started wearing more makeup, which traditionally you did not do, and more lipstick, which traditionally you didn't. So women didn't usually wear that stuff in public a whole lot traditionally, but the flapper girls start to do that. Okay, and this is outrageous to the older generations, right? Because they look at this and go, "Oh my goodness, what has happened? What's happened to our girls?" Right? And of course, not every girl was a flapper. All right, but some did embrace this, and and so these girls would smoke or drink in public, things like that classy ladies traditionally did not do, and so they change how some women act and how women are perceived to some degree. And so these are changes in women's fashions, though, was how they looked, right? And the boas that they'd wear, like I said, it just from the more skin showing to the shorter hair to the makeup and so forth. It was just a big change. Here are a few pictures of what we would deem as the flappers, right? Of course, a lot of them still wore some kind of a head covering, a hat or some type thing, but along with their outfits. But these are some of the 1920s looks. There's some more flappers. The one on the left would be more of a modern day kind of a flapper look, and then um, but the one on the right is from the 1920s. Okay. Now, by today's standards, we probably wouldn't deem these to be like, racy, or objectionable or controversial. But in the 1920s, it was definitely seen that way because of how traditional appearance was and versus what the flappers looked like. All right, so let's look at some more things about women real quick. In the 1920s, the issue of the women's right to vote comes to a head, and women finally get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Okay, more women start going into the workplace as professionals, which traditionally, hadn't happened as much, and so that is a change. More girls are starting to go to college in the 20s. Traditionally, college was mainly for guys. More girls start to go in the 20s. Birth control comes out in the 20s, which allows women now uh, more choice in having children. Of course, the flapper image is a big deal, right, as well, and women's rights in general increase in the 20s. And again, these are clashes between people who thought they should have more rights, people who didn't think they should have those new rights, and all that stuff. So, but the role of the American woman, or the how the American woman is perceived and the things the American woman can do and does really change in the 1920s, more like what we see today. Uh, you know, how women are today compared to how they were before the 20s. All right, next question. What changes came to men's fashions? Well, the men were still a little more conservative in their fashions, but what changes happened? Well, the hair became slicked back for some men. Okay, the slicked hair was kind of a new thing in the 20s. Sometimes they parted it in the middle, or as well, but the slicked hair was more of a new thing. Uh, some men wore the baggy knicker, they call them the knicker pants, the knickerbockers, which were the pants that kind of go down, they're almost like golf pants. They go down to the knee, kind of thing. And you had the high socks. Okay, hats. One thing you're going to notice about pictures from the 20s and even these advertisements, especially the middle one and the one on the right, is you always had to have a hat, whether it was a derby hat, a newsboy hat, you name. I mean, there were multiple different types of hats, but men wore hats in public. Okay, and bow ties became a thing, as well as, of course, the traditional necktie. But what you're noticing here is you dressed up when you went out in public. You might own one suit, but you wore it every time you went out in public. You didn't really wear jeans and t-shirts. They didn't have sweatpants and t-shirts. Okay, they didn't wear pajama pants out in public. Okay, you went out in public as a guy or a girl. You dressed up. You looked nice. That was just part of being classy and part of just what you were expected to do. And so, it's very different than today. Most people don't dress up too much when they go out. Some do still, but most people just kind of whatever they throw on, and they go to the store or whatever. Well, I can remember my grandma, who grew up in the late 20s, or grew up actually throughout most of the 20s, and even into her old age, when if she wanted to go to a store just to get groceries, she dressed up like she was going to church, and that was just what she did, and she expected to look good, and she wanted other people to do the same. But of course, by the time she was older, people weren't doing that anymore, and she didn't like that. She thought people should still dress up. So, but you dressed up in the 20s, so changes in men's fashions, some of the hair, uh, the hats definitely, bow ties became a thing as well as the traditional tie, and of course you dressed up. And speaking of hats, here's an example of the hat craze. You wore a hat out in public. It's just what you did. You had a hat, you wore it. I mean, of course, you took it off when you went inside, and you took it off in the presence of a woman. Okay, and so those were kind of the rules of society. But uh, every guy had a hat. That's what you did. Kind of cool. All right, next question. What were the popular fads or crazes of the 1920s? Well, there were a lot of them. You had all kinds of stuff. You had daredevils, and you had the human fly that they'd shoot out of a cannon, type thing, and really strange stuff like that. Strange contests. People would have flagpole sitting contests or dance marathons. Okay, but also things like the King Tut tomb is discovered by Howard Carter, the British archaeologist, and because of that, all things Egyptian and mummies became real popular. And eventually, the King Tut display, some of these artifacts went on by train, went around the country, and people would flock, to the stops where the train would stop in their cities, and they'd flock to these displays, and they would look at all the archaeological finds. Okay, so things like that. The Miss America pageant starts. That becomes kind of a fad or a craze, and things like Babe Ruth. Okay, we'll talk about this in more detail, but heroes, the larger than life personalities. Of course, baseball was a major craze in the 20s, and Babe Ruth was its biggest star. But spectator sports in general were a craze in the 1920s, and with more money and more disposable income, more people had an opportunity to go watch the sporting events in person. So let's look at some of these celebrities. Okay, and these are just a few, right? But from the sports world, you had people like Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, the baseball player. You also had a boxer named Jack Dempsey. Of course, there were other famous baseball players, other famous boxers, but these were, some of the most famous and popular during the 20s. You had aviators like Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh, who became bigger than life, okay, in the 1920s. Um, and Charles Lindbergh was the first person to fly nonstop from the United States to Europe. And he did this. Other people had tried and not succeeded. Charles Lindbergh did this, became a national hero and famous worldwide as well. And, he was just bigger than life. So these became the celebrities, the heroes, the idols, you know, the the famous people, in society. And it wasn't just, before this, your famous people were kind of your big business tycoons and your presidents and your war heroes, your military generals and so forth. But now it becomes the celebrities, the athletes, the aviators, things like that. All right. Well, let's look at the culture of the Roaring Twenties in a little more detail. First of all, and we'll get to this, we'll talk about this, the radio, of course, becomes a craze of the 20s. The 20s is the radio era because it's when the radio is invented, really, mass produced and into people's homes. Okay. The very first radio station, again, we'll talk about this in more detail, but was in Pittsburgh. And you had companies like General Electric and Westinghouse and RCA that will form the National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC. Okay, what you're going to find is that a lot of some of the major TV stations, NBC, ABC, CBS, stuff like that we get TV, today, they started out as radio stations and broadcasting all kinds of stuff. But the radio is a major part of the culture of the Roaring Twenties, and movies become a major part of the culture of the Roaring Twenties. And so, along with the athletes and the aviators and so forth, who are kind of the celebrities, the movie stars become celebrities as well. Okay, the icons of the 20s. There you see Charlie Chaplin, who was the great silent movie star, and Al Jolson, who was in the very first talking movie, they called it the Talkies, where movies with sound. Okay, so silent movies had existed, then the Talkies come about, okay, starring Al Jolson, and then of course Mary Pickford is kind of America's sweetheart, okay, the famous actress of the 20s. But the Hollywood industry uh, becomes a craze of the 20s. Here is Hollywood. Hollywood starts out as a sleepy little town in California, but because of its kind of ideal location, its picturesque surroundings, uh, and scenic, landscape, and of course the great weather, it becomes the heart of the movie making industry in the country. And so it starts out as Hollywood Land, they called it. Of course, they dropped the land from the big letters on the hillside, and today it just reads Hollywood. But this is the movie making industry, they're right here, and it happens, right? And so the very first talkie, a movie with sound, was The Jazz Singer. Of course, this would not be acceptable today. This would be considered politically incorrect, but because Al Jolson was a white man and he did blackface for the movie. But you can see I like this the you know at 2:30 and 8:45 p.m. Twice daily, a Sunday matinee at 3 o'clock. I like the old billboard and Warner's Theater. There's the marquee out front, and I mean the people out front there with they're all dressed up and the guys with their hats and waiting to go see the movie. So this revolutionized the movie industry because, of course, uh, Thomas Edison had been the guy to kind of create um, the video camera, right? But at first it was just silent. It would just have images, and in the silent movies like Charlie Chaplin was in, if you wanted to have a dialogue going, you'd have the subtitle at the bottom of the screen, what the actors were saying. And of course, a person would be in the theater playing the piano or organ for sound effects, literally, And of course, then once they have the technology to do the movies with sound, the talkies, like we know today, of course, then that all changes. They don't need the in-house piano player, and they don't need the subtitles anymore, in English anyway. So you could just hear the actors talk. And of course, we've always had that in our lifetime, so we take that for granted. But the 20s is kind of when that comes into being. All right. Next question. What did children do for fun? What were the kids' toys in the 20s? What did kids do to have a good time? Well, they did everything from Tinker Toys, there on the top left, which are kind of an early form of Legos, and to metal trucks, to dolls that actually would say mama, okay? Paper dolls there in the top right. You could cut out the clothing and dress the doll all different ways. To marbles, which is actually a real game. There's a real way to play marbles. Kids would go jump rope and roller skates. Those were actual roller skates. So you'd actually put your shoe in those things and then lace or latch it up, and that would be your roller skates, right? And ice skates were the same way. Um, they play tag, and they play. Kids. It still was pretty basic stuff for kids. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have video games. Okay, so you'd go and you'd make your own fun, but you also had some of these new toys to play with. You go out in the street and play stickball, hopscotch, all types of stuff. But kids were more active. They had to be, because you got together with your friends, you played games, you stayed active. All right. Along with question 11, what were some of the famous kids' books that came out in the 20s? Well, Winnie the Pooh comes out in the 20s. So does Bambi and The Velveteen Rabbit, all famous books that, of course, Winnie the Pooh becomes movies, and Bambi the same way, movies and cartoons and you name it, right, that have spawned off of these original books. Um, but yeah, these are some of the favorite kids' books of the 20s. Next question. What were some of the new foods and other innovations of the 20s? Well, things like Welch's grape jam, okay? Jelly, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, you can have them now because Welch's makes a grape jam. Kleenex. What did people use before that? Well, they used the handkerchiefs, right? And so, I mean, ugh. But now we have Kleenex, okay? And Band-Aids. What little kid hasn't put on like 10 Band-Aids at a time, right? Before that, you just use, cloth or, other types of things, gauze to bind up a wound. Well, now you have Band-Aids, okay? Double mint gum, Wrigley's double mint gum comes around. Wrigley's gum. Mr. Wrigley had been into selling baking products, and turned out people didn't like his baking products too much, but he used to give them gum when they bought his baking products, and people said, hey, we don't really like your baking products, but your gum's really good. So he just started making gum and made a fortune off it, and buys the Chicago Cubs baseball team, and uh, their their field, Wrigley Field, is named after him, and there you go. Eskimo pie is like an ice cream bar. Okay, very good. That's kind of a new food in the 20s, and then even that picture says 1930. Toward the end of the 20s, Henry Ford starts making his Model A Ford. So he had his Model T for the most of the 20s, but then the Model A is like the more chic, classy. It's kind of like the the gangster car. It becomes the gangster car look, right? But the Model A Ford becomes the craze. Okay, so those were some of the foods and innovations. Now let's look at the next question. What was the 18th Amendment? Well, this is going to be a big deal. The 20s is going to be marked, among other things, by what's called prohibition. And so the 18th Amendment, passed in 1919, outlawed the manufacture, the selling, the distribution of all alcoholic beverages to all ages throughout the entire U.S. The 18th Amendment in 1919 was prohibition. So you could not make, sell, or distribute, or technically consume alcohol in the US. Well, why was alcohol prohibited? Okay. What were the major causes? The next question. What were the major causes of prohibition? Well, the major causes were, for quite a while leading up to the 1920s, there was a thing called the temperance movement. These were people. people that were part of the temperance movement were calling for the banning of alcohol already because they saw alcohol as a source of crime and disease and immorality and poverty. They said, well, too many men are spending their paycheck on alcohol and making their families poor, and crime is committed, and abuse and things like that as a result of alcohol. So people had already been calling for the outlawing of alcohol before this, and Congress in 1919 puts prohibition into effect. Okay, so of course, some people are going to follow it and some people are not going to follow it. And it depends on where you lived, right? According to some reports, in Kansas, for example, the state of Kansas during the 1920s, which was still largely a farming community, right? Much less population, but they said that basically 95% of the people followed the law on prohibition and only 5% broke it, they believe. But in New York City, for example, of people who wanted to drink, only 5% followed the law and 95% broke the law. So if you wanted to find alcohol during Prohibition, you probably still could. Well, how could you do that? Let's look at what these next ones mean. Next question, speakeasies. How did Prohibition affect the following? Speakeasies. Speakeasies were secret illegal bars. Okay. Uh, they wouldn't have any markings on the outside. You'd go up. You kind of sometimes you had to have a special knock on the door, or they'd have a little sliding peephole type thing. They could see who was knocking on the door, and if you knew the knock or they recognized you, they'd let you in, type thing. And these are often operated by gangsters, organized crime. But depending on where these were, everybody went to them, right? I mean, you'd have people, respected citizens to even cops. The police often, want to drink, so they show up. Very rarely did law enforcement raid and bust the speakeasies, but occasionally they did. But most of the time, it was kind of a wink, wink. Society knew what was going on, and they just kind of let it go. Bootlegging was the making, distributing, or selling alcohol illegally. So people would either make their own alcohol, okay, and distill it themselves, which could be kind of dangerous, and you never know what to expect. Or they could also get a hold of it illegally and transport it and sell it, right? And so a lot of gangsters got involved in this. This became a major moneymaker for the mafia, for organized crime. You'd have rival gangs, fighting over turf, fighting over territory in cities to distribute and sell their illegal alcohol. So you had scenes like the one on the right there, where cars would get shot up and the people inside gunned down, right? But that was bootlegging. And moonshine or moonshiners, moonshine was homemade illegal alcohol. So moonshiners were people who made the homemade illegal alcohol, and they even have a History Channel show, I think it is, or I know there's a TV show called Moonshine, right, where people make their own brews. But so these were ways people could still make their alcohol and sell it and consume it, and most of the time they just got away with it. This was, even though it was a law not to consume alcohol, most people just kind of looked the other way during the 1920s. But prohibition was in effect throughout the 20s. So the next question is, how and why was prohibition repealed? Well, prohibition finally gets repealed. And here you go, some more pictures. Moonshiners, bootleggers, and rum runners. The 18th Amendment in 1919, right? And occasionally bootleggers would get apprehended, and you had gangsters involved, right? This is where Al Capone is going to make, by today's standards, millions of dollars a year. And he's not alone in that. You have other big mobsters throughout the country doing the same thing. Of course, the mobsters, these rival gangs, will go after each other. Okay? And it's during this time that you have a lot of the cops and a lot of the law enforcement were on the take. They'd be assigned to go after the mafia. They'd be assigned to go after the illegal alcohol operation in town. And they'd go up with the intention maybe of busting it, and then they'd get offered a bunch of money by a gangster to just kind of turn and walk away, and a lot of them would take the money, and so they got bought off. Well, there was a group called the Untouchables, led by a guy named Elliot Ness, and these were guys, law enforcement, FBI and law enforcement, who they couldn't be bought off, they couldn't be touched, by the bribes, and these guys went after the criminals and got them. There is Scarface himself, right? Al Capone, who ran Chicago and made, like I said, by today's standards, millions, tens of millions of dollars a year on illegal alcohol sales and illegal gambling rings, and you name it. If it was illegal, he was into it, and was making money off it. He finally gets busted for not paying taxes, of all things, not paying taxes. But Al Capone, of course, is the godfather of Chicago, as they called the head mafioso, right, of a mafia family. He never actually, he never was the guy that was doing the crime. He had underlings, he had guys under him that were committing the crimes, but Capone was giving them the orders to do so, right? But he finally gets locked up. He'll be sent to Alcatraz, which is the island prison in San Francisco Bay. But yeah, he's probably the most famous gangster, right, of all time in the U.S. Maybe of anywhere, right? And the guy that kind of finally brings him down is J. Edgar Hoover, right, the head of the FBI, and the FBI, Hoover's team, who through a series of investigations and matching signatures and handwriting from one of the books of one of Capone's illegal gambling rings. That's how they will eventually bust him, and on not paying taxes on all the money he was bringing in to this illegal gambling ring. All right, so let's go back to the question then. How and why was prohibition repealed? Well, first of all, it was repealed in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. So the 21st Amendment undid the 18th Amendment. So prohibition lasted for 14 years. But why was it repealed? Well, it was eventually repealed because it wasn't really working. People who wanted their alcohol were still getting it, and very few people were actually following the law that wanted to drink, right? And like I said, a lot of the police were in on it, and law enforcement, they didn't care. And so it wasn't working. It wasn't very effective. Not only that, it was a huge source of income for organized crime, for the mafia. And not only that, the government realized, hey, if we make it legal again, then we can tax alcohol and make a bunch of money for the U.S. government off of taxes. That'll be a source of income. So we'll hurt the mafia, operations by making it legal, and they won't be able to make all kinds of money off illegal alcohol, running, and then the government will get tax dollars from the sale of alcohol. So that's how and why it was repealed. And so when it's repealed in 1933, some people are celebrating. Of course, like I said, a lot of people are drinking all along anyway, but some people see it as another reason to celebrate. All right, getting to the end here. What was the background of radio? Well, the 20s is the radio decade. It's the Roaring 20s. It's the Jazz Age, which we'll talk about, but it is the radio decade. The background is this: it was experimented with during and after World War One. Armies wanted a form of wireless communication, and it was perfected not by an American inventor, but by an Italian named by the last name of Marconi, Marconi. And Mr. Marconi figures out how to transmit sound via radio waves, and he can pump this sound through a box, a tube, and people can now have radio. And so the very first radio station, like we talked about, is KDKA in Pittsburgh. Had very few listeners at first, but by 1929, there are 600 stations around the country with 50 million listeners nationwide. And so the radio becomes a craze of the 1920s. Okay, there is no TV yet. There are no computers, no internet. Okay, radio is the way you listen to live entertainment, unless you're at a theater or at a movie, or at a movie house, right? And so which is what they used to call movie theaters. They used to call them movie houses, right? But you could actually be at a theater, watching a play or a musical, or you could be at a movie theater. But other than that, or unless you were in a stadium watching a sporting event. But if you weren't physically at those places, you would have to get live entertainment via the radio. And so it's also a way you got news. You listen to sporting events. You had sitcoms, like we think of sitcoms as TV things. Well, they started out as radio, radio sitcoms that were funny or informative radio shows. All those were types of things that existed. But by the end of the 1920s, you had 600 radio stations. You had 50 million Americans listening to the radio, probably every day, right? Because that's you tune in for information and for entertainment, and so this becomes a nationwide craze. The 1920s is also called the Jazz Age. Uh, this is a time when jazz music takes hold, and you have famous musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington that would play their music. They became masters, right, on the trumpet and other instruments, and they would play at clubs, in New York City or down in New Orleans, Louisiana, and those kind of became the hearts of the jazz music world at first, right? And if you think about it, and of course, New Orleans uh, jazz. Well, we know our Utah Jazz basketball team, but the Utah franchise used to be located in New Orleans. And when it came time for them to come up with a team name, they called it the Jazz because jazz music, is one of the defining aspects of the city of New Orleans. And so when they moved the team to Utah eventually, to Salt Lake, they just kept the name Jazz, even though Utah has very little, if anything, to do with jazz music traditionally. We kept the name, so that's why the Utah basketball team is called the Jazz. But New York City and New Orleans were the hearts and the centers of jazz music, and these were a couple of their most famous musicians. But jazz music became the source for the new dances, and of course, people on the radio would listen to jazz, right? Um, and it was just the thing to do. So, but the next question says, how did radio increase national unity and affect American life in general? Well, it creates a national culture. Okay, that's how it creates unity. It creates a national culture. So, there's national news stories. There are national radio shows, that everybody's hearing at the same time. There are you tune in and you're all hearing the same baseball game or you're listening to the same boxing match at the same time. Okay, you're listening to the same songs at the same time on the radio. You're all hearing Louis Armstrong's latest song or Duke Ellington's latest performance. Okay, jazz music becomes the national music because everybody's listening to it, at the same time on the radio. So these, this becomes the medium. This becomes the way people get entertained, get their news, get their music, and also kind of develop a national, uh, dialogue or a national um, kind of way of speaking. Okay, because of course, depending on the part of the country you're in, you have your accent, your twang, your whatever, and on the radio you'd hear national newscasters that had a very um, standardized way of speaking English, and so you'd hear that, and you'd learn new words and learn how to pronounce things, and that maybe you couldn't pronounce before or whatever, and people start speaking more similarly as well. And it's weird to think about, but that was one of the side effects of this whole thing. So it creates kind of this national culture, is what radio does. And of course, like I said, jazz music's going to be one of those things that people just can't get enough of on the radio. And here is, again, Louis Armstrong on the left and Duke Ellington on the right, and bigger than life personalities, and just the music that they produce and other jazz musicians produce was phenomenal. Something else that happens during the 1920s, and it's not really on your paper, but um, it's called the Harlem Renaissance. And although it does have to do with jazz music, in Harlem, which is a traditionally black area, black neighborhood of New York City, um, the 1920s sees kind of this flowering of culture, of black culture in Harlem. It becomes kind of the epicenter for black culture and um, all new things, that the African American community promoted and really liked. And so the jazz music, was at the center of it, right? So you had these dance clubs and music clubs were in Harlem that people would flock to on the weekends to listen to the jazz and dance. And you have some great black poets and authors and others that you know that that come out of Harlem. And so Harlem kind of becomes heaven, for a lot of African Americans and for the African American culture in the 1920s because of all the new things that were coming out of the area. So, like I said, it's a new generation of black artists and intellectuals, creates a flourishing African American culture. People like Langston Hughes, okay, and the Cotton Club was the most famous club, uh, there to listen to Louis Armstrong or uh, Duke Ellington and dance. And it wasn't just African Americans that went, though. You had a lot of whites come into Harlem as well because they wanted to go to the clubs. They wanted to listen to the music. They wanted to be part of the dancing. They wanted to, see what was going on. So this became, this was the place to be, all right, in the 20s. And the last question, we'll go back to the radio for a minute. What were some popular radio shows of the 1920s? Well, you know, I always think you really had to be creative to be a good radio personality, especially do a great radio show. When TV comes along, in some ways it kind of ruined it. In some cases it made us lazy, right? Because we're spoiled, right? If I'm watching a baseball game on TV, I can see the movements of the players and I can see the action in real time and I see what's happening, second by second. Well, if I'm listening to a game on the radio, I have to imagine what the players look like and how they move and where this pitch was. And I mean, I have a radio commentator telling me stuff, but I have to imagine a lot too. I have to be creative. If I'm watching a TV show, I can see the actors, I can hear their voices, I see their facial expressions and their gestures. But if I'm listening to a radio show, I have to imagine all that stuff, right? And so radio really required a lot of creativity and imagination on the parts of both the performers and on the part of the listeners. And so some of the most popular shows, some of them were funny, some of them were dramas, mysteries, old Wild West shows, things like that. Some of them were more news shows and um, things like that. But popular shows starting on the left there, the Abbott, Abbott, and Costello, Costello, Abbott and Costello show. And these guys were funny. This was a comedy duo. Their most famous bit was Who's on First? And it's a classic, okay? Who's on First? It's a baseball skit. Amos and Andy was another famous one there. Uh, the Shadow, which is in the bottom center, the Shadow was a mystery drama. Okay. Uh, Superman was a famous radio show. Of course, it became a movie later on. Gunsmoke, bottom right, was a radio show, Wild West Cowboys, show that became a TV show later on. But and a lot of these shows did become TV, made for TV when TV comes around in the 1950s. But yeah, Abbott and Costello, Amos and Andy, you know, The Shadow, Gunsmoke, Superman, all these shows that would entertain people, and they came on, oftentimes once a week, and you couldn't miss them. You didn't have DVR, or a way to record them, so you had to be in front of the radio listening when these shows came on each time, and you made sure you were so you didn't miss anything, right? And this is part of what creates the national culture too, a unity in the culture is that people are all listening to these shows together, and then they're talking about them the next day at school or at work or things like, hey, did you hear Amos and Andy last night? Or hey, did you hear the latest Abbott and Costello piece? And so this creates kind of the national unity aspect of what the radio does. So anyway, this has been a long presentation, but the 1920s was fantastic in so many ways. It first modern American decade, in my opinion. It revolutionizes the country, and it's a good time to be alive for a lot of people. We've come off the victory in World War One. We're on a high. The economy's on a high, and times are good for most people in the 20s. And so I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I encourage you to keep studying more about the 1920s if any of these individual things piqued an interest. Okay, we'll talk to you later.